Have you ever tried to talk to other people about climate change? I mean, have a really deep conversation about the threat of climate change and how it makes you feel, and talk about fears of what could happen in the future as climate change becomes more and more severe. I've tried to talk to people that I'm close to about climate change over the years, and I found that there are a few common types of reactions. Most people respond in a way where they just completely shut down. It becomes a very one-directional conversation, and I can tell that the other person is uncomfortable. They just don't know what to say. Another reaction I've gotten on some occasions, definitely less common, is a doomerist response. This usually comes from men who will say something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, we're completely screwed. There's nothing you can do about it. You might as well enjoy the present." I've talked to several therapists about my fears about climate change. Not that it's something that impacts me on an emotional level regularly, but I know it's probably affecting me on a subconscious level. So I've tried to talk to therapists about it. And the first therapist I talked to about it said that it sounds like I was overreacting to the problem. She told me that I was probably worried more than I should be about how severe the impacts of climate change could be. I responded that all of my fears about climate change are based in peer-reviewed science. I'm someone who takes science very seriously and is very careful about where my information comes from. And there's a lot of really intelligent, really specific experts who are telling us that we're entering an extremely dangerous environment as climate change will become more and more severe over the coming decades and centuries. I could tell that when I responded with that information, my therapist took a different strategy, but it was definitely maybe thoughts that cross most people's minds when I do talk about climate change, that I am overreacting. For more information about where my concerns about climate change do come from, check out my climate collapse video. One time I was dating someone and it was getting a little bit serious, and I decided to open up to her about how fixated on climate change I am. I don't really confront most people about this. It's really more people that I'm closer to where I'll breach the conversation. So I broke down my position and what I was thinking about in terms of climate change, and it was fascinating because her response was more confident than anyone I'd ever had a reaction from before, and she confidently told me that she thought God would solve our problems, and she had faith that God would protect us from the worst consequences of climate change. All of these reactions are bizarre to me. I really don't understand them. When I was exposed to the concept of climate change and the severe consequences that could possibly arise out of climate change, I was driven to solve the problem. And I think this is the most rational response to climate change. If you find out that there's this unprecedented threat to human survival, to me, the only rational response is to do as much as you possibly can to try and solve the problem. In reality, being obsessed with climate change seems to be extremely rare. To have convictions about solving the climate crisis is extremely, extremely rare. Anyone who clicked on this video is probably not a normal type of thinker. Anyone who would click on a long form video about the psychology around climate change is going to be someone who is definitely not normal. And I'm extremely interested in the question, why aren't people as obsessed with climate change as we are? I truly could not understand this phenomenon until I was exposed to psychology that helped explain what was going on. Like many others, I became fixated on the climate crisis when I watched An Inconvenient Truth in 2006. And before that, I had a number of years' experience as an general environmental activist. So I had about a decade of activism experience under my belt before the book Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change was published in 2014 by George Marshall. George Marshall can be described as a climate communications specialist with experience at Greenpeace and the Rainforest Foundation. I'm going to extrapolate a few of the interesting lessons from Don't Even Think About It, but I really recommend reading the entire book to absorb all of the incredible lessons that the book does have to teach. One enlightening message of the book is that environmentalists usually take the approach where we provide really scary facts and figures about whatever environmental catastrophe there is that we're advocating on, and we expect that to motivate action from our audience. In reality, this approach can be very counterproductive. When we throw these scary facts and figures at normal people, their reaction can be similar to receiving a terminal illness diagnosis. And for some people who are diagnosed with terminal illness, that information can be extremely overwhelming. And some of them go into a deep state of denial and completely shut down. And so if we tell people that climate change could cause the collapse of human civilization and that there are going to be massive geographic parts of the world that will be underwater and other parts of the world are going to be desertified and no longer able to sustain life. All of this information is extremely scary, and some people completely shut down. George Marshall contrasts the strategies of the climate movement with the emotional support that is provided by religion. He writes, "We, climate change activists, have contempt for doubt, and no one is ever at hand to walk through it together. We expect people to deal with their hopes and fears in isolation, constrained by a socially policed silence, and given no encouragement other than a few energy-saving consumer choices and the odd petition. Nor is there any discussion of forgiveness for ourselves or our forebears. As Hunter pointed out to me, we give people a heavy moral load of guilt, responsibility, and blame, but no way out. The critics are right in this regard. If climate change really were a religion, it would be a wretched one, offering guilt, blame, and fear, but no recourse to salvation or forgiveness." This idea had a profound effect on me. I've been guilty of this my entire activist career. I tried to understand the greatest threats of climate change, and I load those facts and figures and all that science onto people. And I always thought that would work to motivate people. And ever since reading this perspective, I've thought of ways that we can provide the emotional support that a church and the community around a church provide. For this reason, the first video after the climate collapse video that I made was the Stoicism video about how Stoic philosophy can help provide solace in the climate crisis. And I'd like to explore other ways of building community in the climate movement so that we can help support each other emotionally, as well as be involved in direct action and activism to change the direction of society. The last thing that I want to do with this video is to shift the blame for the climate crisis on climate change activists. I have tremendous amounts of respect for the minority of people who have actually gone out of their way to try to change the direction of society. It is not our fault as activists that society is continuing to move the direction that it is. And our approach to use the fear around the potential consequences of climate change and assume that that would result in more climate activism is a completely rational approach. And it's a rational expectation. And it's important to remember that people who do shut down when they're exposed to this information are not responding in a rational way. You could describe the reaction from most people who fall into different forms of denial as helpless, as incompetent, as childish, or as inept. And I think part of this video is to help people see that their response needs to change. For lack of a better term, people need to man up in this time of crisis and wake up and do something about the crisis that we're in. But I also do think that as climate change activists, those of us who do decide to take action, we can be more effective if we bear in mind that scaring people with scientific facts and figures isn't going to produce the results we expect for most people. In order to understand climate inaction, we have to understand the difference between rational and emotional intelligence, or the rational and emotional sides of our brains. Here, it's explained by George Marshall.
We know that built within the very architecture of a brain are different ways of processing information. It suggests here that these are hemispheric, but actually that's misleading. It's more complex than that. We know, though, that there is what we could say, there's a number of different terms for this. We'll stick at the moment with the analytic reasoning. It deals with numbers, data, symbols and logic. It deals with the core stuff of science, basically. This is a critical side. This is our advanced cognition, which is necessary for us to build the modern world. This is what makes us humans. This is what makes us the stupendously smart beings that we are. But ultimately, what drives us, what makes us take action, what moves us forward, is the affective reasoning. It is this deeper, more historical brain, which is the response which underlies the rational. So it's a conversation which is happening constantly between these two sides. This side is much more related to the things which are urgent and immediate, here and now, proximity, the things we've experienced, drawing on our immediate direct experience. The social values and the social cues. We're constantly reading and scanning the people around us for them to tell us what we should pay attention to or what we should disattend. These cues, this is what's important, I need to follow this. We do this all of the time, mostly subconsciously. Metaphor. Metaphor is another form of experience. This thing looks like this other thing I already know about. So our brains, given a choice between two things which are close, will shift to default. They'll shift to the one that seems familiar to them already. We think metaphorically in lots of ways. Metaphor isn't just about language. Metaphor is also about experience, I'll say later. And above all, the language of this side, the affective side, is the language of stories. This side is dealing with data. This side is dealing with stories. Now we can see we have a challenge here already with climate change, which is so strongly based in the science. It's coming in on this side here. The assumption for a long time for science communicators has been that this in itself will mobilize us to take action. But if we can simply find a way of converting the science into forms that people can grasp, that it will move them. Of course, their assumptions on that are themselves from social values, that the values of science are based in the values of this language over here. But it is clear that is not the case. It is clear that over the past 20 years, the evidence of climate change has built and built and built and built, and yet we seem to be no closer to dealing with that. The levels of risk become ever more serious, and yet we seem to be unable to accept it or cope with it because we are locked over on this side. We have a disconnection between the information and the stories that we're telling ourselves about it with the social cues.
So most people are driven primarily by emotion, and science and the rational side of their brains have a much lower influence. One of the things I want to do in this video is verify all of the information that I'm giving you. And this is really an effort to be consistent with the basic premise of how we ought to approach the world. So let's verify some of Marshall's points with peer-reviewed scientific studies. Here's one research paper published in Biological Conservation called "Why Facts Don't Change Minds: Insights from Cognitive Science for the Improved Communication of Conservation Research." In my climate apocalypse video, I explain why peer-reviewed science is better information than any other type of information you can have in regards to science, and meta-analysis is on an even higher level. So this study published in Health Communication, a meta-analysis comparing the effectiveness of narrative versus statistical evidence, health versus non-health context. As they describe in the paper, the meta-analysis included 50 studies. The moderation analysis indicated that narrative evidence had a significant advantage over statistical evidence for health messages advocating for prevention behaviors. Compared to non-student samples, the narrative evidence trumped statistical evidence for health-related issues. So basically, they looked at 50 different studies and confirmed that narrative evidence had a stronger influence than statistical evidence, or stories had a larger influence than statistical data. Another interesting study I found along this theme is published in Environmental Research called "Is There a Link Between Cognitive Abilities and Environmental Awareness? Cross-National Evidence." Basically, they studied whether more intelligent societies had a higher level of awareness of environmental issues and climate change. I'm aware that this is a more controversial statement around climate change because intelligence is a hot button topic and we're looking at entire societies rather than individual people. But the beauty of science is that if you think that a scientist has come to incorrect conclusions, other scientists can try to replicate their results or try and disprove them. Again, I want to emphasize that it is not climate activists' fault for using scientific reports to try and convince people to change society's direction on climate change. The fact that people trust stories over scientific data is immensely stupid. I talked about this quite a bit in the climate collapse video, but just think about the expertise behind peer-reviewed science. The scientists who publish these studies have a university degree in their expertise, so 4-year undergraduate degree. Some of them complete a master's degree for 1 or 2 years, and then let's say another 4 years to get the PhD. On top of that, they have years and years of research between the time that they got their PhD and whenever they published a paper. Also, the peer review process requires that many other experts in the field have to review the methodologies of their research and approve the paper's publication before it can be published. So we're talking about years and years, really decades of experience behind peer-reviewed scientific studies. And somehow basic stories that people tell are more influential than peer-reviewed scientific data. It is absolutely mind-boggling to me that people think this way, and really we need to change. The thing about psychology is that they are making generalizations based on how most people behave. So it's not true that all people are more influenced by stories than science. I am in a philosophy club, and we recently had a discussion around logic versus intuition and which part of our minds should we believe more? The logical part of our mind or whatever intuition tells us? I was in a group with about 7 other people, and almost everyone there were saying that they trust their intuition more than logic. And it shows just how entrenched these values go. Not only is it a subconscious phenomenon that is happening, but people are unashamedly saying that they trust their gut instincts and gut reactions more than information provided by science and logic. Before I read Marshall's book, I had no idea that there was a separation between the rational and emotional side of the brain, and there were different types of intelligence in the world. Shortly after reading Marshall's book, I started working in the corporate world, and a few years later, one of the managers made most of our department read this book, Switch: How to Change Things When Change is Hard by Chip Heath and Dan Heath. In this book, they talk about the typical workplace environment being separated into 2 different types of people, the elephant and the rider. The elephant to them is usually in the managerial class. They are emotionally intelligent enough to land in these higher management positions, and really they're the most influential people in the organization, but they're not necessarily rationally intelligent. Workplaces will also have people who are more analytical, who the Heath brothers define as the rider. Essentially, they're saying that the rider is kind of steering the elephant in the same way that a rider might ride a horse. They need to steer this clumsy, large elephant in ways that aren't so damaging to the organization. The elephant is emotional and clumsy and difficult to steer. An analytical rider type person doesn't necessarily need to be a data analyst, but it is eventually where I settled in my corporate environment, and the Heath brothers tried to resolve the issue that most people aren't steered by data analytics alone. So if you show most people a graph, even if the data that informs that graph is completely accurate, which sometimes it is not, and reliable, the managerial class or the elephant sometimes aren't very swayed by looking at that data. The Heath brothers provide an interesting example of how you can go beyond the data to influence elephant type people. They tell the story of an analyst who worked in a large organization that had offices around the world. And this analyst was able to hire an intern for the summer. They had suspicions that the procurement policy at the company was not efficient and needed to change. Every factory in the company had their own separate procurement process and would purchase items for the factory from different sources. The analyst knew that this was problematic and wanted to propose having one single source for all the protective equipment that people use in the factory. What they decided to do was send their intern to every factory that the company operated and collect the protective gloves that people wear in that factory throughout the summer that they worked at the company. And so they went to each individual factory, and by the end of summer they had a box full of all the different brands of gloves that all the different employees used. And it was a box of literally hundreds of different pairs of protective gloves. And the analyst called a board meeting with executives in the company and showed them all of the different data data that proved that there were all these different companies that they were purchasing the PPE from. But what they decided to do to really sway the emotional elephant type mind executive managerial class was take the box of all the different gloves that the intern collected and dump it in the middle of the boardroom desk. And this is the emotional impact. This is the tactile information that can be provided when you have the actual physical gloves in the presence of the executives, as opposed to it just being a number on a graph in a PowerPoint presentation. Another recommendation that the Heath brothers make is to break down a very large problem into smaller, achievable baby steps. This is super applicable with climate change as well, as we can break this enormous, seemingly impossible problem to solve into smaller, bite-sized, achievable goals. One goal, which I decided to pursue, was to switch our energy source to renewable energy. Another achievable goal is energy conservation. Other people tend to like to focus on converting people's diets from a meat-heavy diet to more vegan or vegetarian diets. And another strategy is to focus on transportation, whether that be electric vehicles, public transportation, or bicycling. The goal is to switch people's focus of attention on the large, very difficult problem, which would be climate change, and focus instead on the smaller, achievable topics like renewable energy. I think it's particularly important to verify that the information you're getting from self-help books, whether it be corporate professional guidance or personal self-help books, it's really important to verify that the information you're being given has some sort of basis in science and has been tested through the scientific process. And you can see that there is some research that supports the idea that the secret to accomplishing big goals lies in breaking them into flexible, bite-sized chunks, according to this research published in Applied Psychology. They say sub-goals can make all the difference when ambitious targets seem too daunting. As I continued along my journey of self-discovery, realizing that I was more on the rational side of the spectrum of intelligence, and most people were not there, I also had the privilege and access to therapy through my work. And eventually I was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, which was extremely enlightening to me because it explained why I just seemed to be missing out on a lot of the subtle communication nuances that were happening between most people and I completely missed, which is a very common phenomenon with autistic people. We tend to miss some of those nuanced behavioral communication strategies that most people use to navigate social environments. And whether you are on the autistic spectrum or you don't believe in that at all, and you just see yourself as more rational and less emotionally intelligent, or even if you do see yourself as extremely emotionally intelligent, I would highly recommend How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. This was recommended to me so many times by so many different people, and I finally read it pretty late in life. One really amazing recommendation from the book is that you should never argue with people. The example Carnegie gives is of a used car salesman who is responsible for selling Chevy vehicles. And he talks about an example where a man is coming into his dealership and is looking for a pickup truck. And the guy comes in and he says, I really love the Ford F-150. It's my favorite vehicle, but I thought just for kicks, I would come in and check out Chevy and see what you guys have to offer. And the salesman in the book would use the strategy of arguing with this type of person immediately and just say, look, the Ford F-150 is garbage compared to the Chevy Silverado. You really need the Chevy Silverado. It is the greatest truck on the market. It's good for this reason and this reason and this reason, and the Ford just can't compete. It's like day and night. And this strategy would often completely backfire, and the salesperson had no idea why. The recommendation is that instead of arguing and telling the other person that their position is wrong right off the bat, it's much better to start with where you agree with the person that you're trying to convince. So when the salesperson hears the person say, oh, I really love the Ford F-150, the best strategy is to actually agree with them and say, oh man, the Ford F-150 is a phenomenal truck. I mean, you got the horsepower and you got the space, and you want to agree with them and just tell them all the different features of the Ford F-150 that you think are also phenomenal. And then from there, slip in the details about the Chevy Silverado that you would argue are better than the Ford F-150. You'd say, oh yeah, the Ford F-150's horsepower is one of the best in the market, but I'm not sure if you know this, but the Chevy Silverado is a little bit stronger. Or the Ford F-150 has one of the most spacious interiors of all the pickup trucks in the market, but check out the Chevy Silverado. Take a seat inside this beast because it's actually slightly more spacious. There are all sorts of really good tips and tricks on how to win friends and influence people. And I actually think it's one of the worst titled books in the entire history of books, because the title, How to Win Friends and Influence People, almost sounds Machiavellian. Like you have to trick people into liking you, and you have to trick people into making decisions other than what they would naturally do. But a huge part of the book is just convincing you that you have to be authentically interested in other people. You have to make an effort to learn the names of the people you meet, even if you're terrible at learning names. You have to show genuine interest in other people and ask them about their lives with thoughtful questions. And another really cool recommendation is to give people compliments. And Carnegie recommends giving people authentic compliments. So compliments that you really truly mean. And this is not something I would always do, because I would see that someone was really good at something or had this amazing accomplishment and assume that they knew that they had knocked it out of the park, that they achieved something amazing and didn't need to be reminded of that. But if you give someone an authentic compliment, it really does brighten their day. And you, as the compliment giver, also get to experience a really nice interaction with someone. I was surprised at how much of an improvement on daily existence this is, and I try to practice this to this day. It's also interesting how authenticity seems to have had a big impact on modern politics. I think of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders as two politicians who practice authenticity. And with Donald Trump, I wouldn't say it's because he is an honest person. Like, I'm not saying that Donald Trump is an honest person. I think it's objectively a fact that he lies at a rate that's just absolutely wild. But the fact that neither Trump nor Sanders read from a script or use talking points when interacting with people in the media have a huge impact on their popularity as politicians. It makes them seem more authentic. So I only gave you a few tips and tricks from Carnegie's book. As with all of these books, I highly recommend reading them to get get all of the different recommendations. How to Win Friends and Influence People was written in 1936. So I think it's especially important to verify that the information given by Carnegie is accurate and not just old wives' tales about human psychology. And we can verify that starting with agreement is a better strategy than starting with disagreements when you're in a negotiation process. So, for example, in this study published in Psychology Research and Behavior Management, the effect of perspective taking on the mediation process is the topic of this study. And the results are that in conflict situations, the level of hostility decreases the most when the mediation process is accompanied by perspective taking. So perspective taking being an example where in the car salesman example, he says, oh yeah, the Ford F-150 is a phenomenal vehicle. I could see why you love that truck. There's also some research that shows that authenticity is a beneficial feature to utilize in the real world, especially in the political world, which is not something necessarily discussed by Carnegie, but just verifies that authenticity is the right strategy. In this case, published in PLOS, Perceiving Politicians as True to Themselves, Development and Validation of the Perceived Political Authenticity Scale. And in this one, we find that higher perceived political authenticity for specific politicians is positively associated with party identification and the intention to vote for politicians. However, I did find research that contradicts Carnegie's assertion that being truly authentic is something that necessarily needs to happen to influence other people. According to this study published in Psychological Science, Are You For Real? Perceptions of authenticity are systematically biased and not accurate. In this, the conclusions are that people are usually very confident in their ability to tell who is being genuine and who is pretending. However, research shows that one cannot accurately identify who is being real. Thus, judgment of others' authenticity cannot be relied upon. So what I glean from this is that it might be more important to put up a facade of authenticity rather than being truly authentic, because people are actually not that good at identifying true authenticity. If we go back to Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, Trump is someone who has switched positions conveniently throughout the last half century and is known for chronically lying constantly about every little thing. Whereas Bernie Sanders has had the same political perspective for decades and hasn't really changed it that much. Yet each politician is, I would say, equally popular. If anything, you could argue that Donald Trump is way more popular than Bernie Sanders. I'd like to use this opportunity to communicate just what a minefield it is when you try to find scientific information about human behavior or scientific information in general on the internet. So I made this Google search here, are authentic people more well liked? And if you look at the AI results from Google, the sources that they're using to generate their AI overview are all really terrible, to be honest. One article here is a Substack article that's just randomly published by a person, not necessarily a scientific study. I haven't looked into it. Let's look at it actually. So I'm just browsing through this article. There are some footnotes here. And if we scroll to the bottom, let's see what kind of sources this person is using. Okay, these are all scientific journals. So this source might be a good source. And then you have an Instagram post here, and then you have a YouTube post. But you have to be really careful and verify that all of these different information sources are using peer-reviewed science in their information. and it's not really true. Here we have a LinkedIn post. As you continue to scroll down the Google results, the closest thing we have to an actual peer-reviewed article is this Psychology Today post, which is, let's say, 3/4 down the Google results page, which isn't directly a peer-reviewed study, but I do find that Psychology Today usually posts all of their information based on peer-reviewed studies. But honestly, I recommend diving into all the sources of all the information that you get, because most of the time on the internet, it's not based on peer-reviewed science. I can't emphasize this enough though. Always check the sources, check the fine print, look at where information is coming from, and make sure it's based on peer-reviewed science. Let's jump back to Marshall's book and talk about the conformity bias. This is absolutely mind-blowing. I just absolutely shocked by this as someone who studied philosophy and has been a climate activist for decades. Basically, the idea is that if a climate activist comes out and gets frustrated and tells people, nobody gives a crap about climate change, they're just venting their frustrations at society. The way that most people respond to this information is that whether it's conscious or subconscious, they think, oh, nice. If most people don't care about this, I don't have to care either. Most people's ethical and moral norms are just shaped by the rest of society. Absolutely bizarre, and it's something that absolutely needs to change. But as climate activists, we can change the way we talk about things. For example, you could say, it's so frustrating. We are living in an unprecedented time in history. The world is on the cusp of an enormous disaster of climate change, and most people go out there and are buying these giant pickup trucks and SUVs and don't seem to care about the problem at all. Instead of focusing on that, the better message would be to isolate other people as being moral deviants. So instead, frame it like, we are in this unprecedented time in history, and oil executives and auto industry executives are pushing these heavy and profitable SUVs and pickup trucks on people and destroying the planet, which is actually probably closer to the truth and a much more efficient message for those of us in climate activism. Sadly, it is very easy to confirm that conformity bias is a dominant influence in society. According to this International Review of Social Psychology study, a systematic review of research on conformity, which is another meta-analysis. In this case, they completed a systematic review which offers a comprehensive overview of 48 relevant articles. And of these recent studies, they confirm the prevalence of conformity across diverse contexts, basically confirming that conformity bias is a universal aspect of human psychology. It doesn't have to be how every single person thinks, it just has to be how most people think. To end this video, it is important to note that we do not fully understand human psychology yet. They're still learning a lot. If we did, it would be pretty easy to solve climate change. It's largely a problem of human behavior. It's interesting on this topic as well to bring up Yuval Noah Harari's discussions around artificial intelligence and the capacity for artificial intelligence to fill some of the gaps in psychological research and truly understand human behavior and perfect the art of manipulating human behavior on this planet, and that this artificial intelligence could be utilized to lead humanity in some very dark directions. To understand how this could work, just look at the AI search results that I used before. It pointed people to LinkedIn, Reddit, and magazine articles. And it would be super easy for artificial intelligence, especially a monopoly artificial intelligence, to point society in certain directions. And as it gets more intelligent, who knows what strategies it could use to manipulate people. Another question people might have after being exposed to all this psychology and reading the books is, are most people stupid? And I am in the position where, yeah, I do think that most people are not very rationally intelligent. They seem to be, for the most part, easily manipulated through their emotions. And as I've witnessed in the corporate world and being involved in the political world for some time, is that rationally intelligent people don't seem to be as socially successful in this world, and that the people who dominate the movement and direction of society are usually the most emotionally intelligent people. And this has been a painful process and a painful realization for me. And the question might arise is that, are people so stupid generally that extinction is inevitable? My response to this is maybe. We are definitely headed in a very deadly direction. You can watch my climate collapse video to get a better sense of what the science is. In regards to that, from what I've seen from most scientists, they say that full extinction is probably not a very likely chance, but if we did have a collapse of civilization, it would mean the death of billions of people on this planet. In my Stoicism video, I did talk about how it was tempting to become like Diogenes and reject society. I also was influenced by this scene in There Will Be Blood, where Daniel Plainview talks about his view of people. And I definitely have opposite strategies and interests and values as Daniel Plainview, but could relate to his misanthropy.
There are times when I look at people and I see nothing worth liking.
But here's the thing, you don't always have to love people to act the right way. In my survivalist utilitarianism video, I explain why working to maximize our chances of survival is the most rationally consistent behavior that we could adopt. And you could use the psychological tools in this video to influence people and move them in the right direction. Unfortunately, many environmentalists give up because it's honestly a really difficult thing to try and combat climate change, and we are still moving in the wrong direction, objectively. This is where I do think that my video on Stoicism can give people the power to sustain their efforts in mitigating climate change. And I also released the video on climate politics and recommended different areas for political engagement. And in my survivalist utilitarianism video, I talk about how adopting survivalist utilitarianism is an extremely rewarding and meaningful part of life. So the main message of this channel is not to undermine your faith in humanity. It is to stay principled and never stop fighting, even if all of our efforts seem to lead to failure. Thanks for watching this video all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.